buttress my conclusion, but that it is a sufficient condition as well, right? The gesticulation of my right hand is both necessary and in itself satisfies the condition for the existence of a human hand, right? So that the act itself isn't just a necessary act, because were it to be, and he doesn't say this, Moore doesn't say this, this is why it's great for educational purposes, because you get to fill it with so much meaning. But it's important to recognize, and it's absolutely undeniable, that were it to be only necessary, Moore's argument would be weaker, because there might be any other number of necessary conditions that could facilitate in that proof, right? This is the problem with, though we all know that smoking leads to cancer, and this is undeniable fact, or abuse of alcohol will lead to the cirrhosis of liver, correlation is no demonstration of proof. Right? There are arguably other environmental factors, I mean, and I hate this argument, right? But it is true to be consistent. There are any other number of environmental factors, including genetics, including exposure to all types of crap, that could possibly have led a smoker to get lung cancer, right? The idea is, I mean, we all know, and we say, all right, enough, but we know that there is a relationship between smoking and lung cancer, but the idea is that it's a correlation. It's not a proof. It's not a proof. Why? Because it's not necessary. I mean, it's necessary, but it isn't a sufficient condition. Moore recognizes this and builds in the sufficiency so that you can't say it's like smoking, right? No, this demonstration is necessary, it's required, but it's also in itself all that you need to do, which is why it's so short. But don't sleep. That's sort of ghetto terminology. Don't undermine, don't overlook the importance of the argument based on the brevity of the argument, right? Just because it's a very short, very, very concise argument doesn't mean it's not as deeply complex as, you know, if it were to go on for pages. The idea is his demonstrative performative act of here is my right hand is both necessary and sufficient. Therefore, there can't be anything else that has sort of interfered with or introduced itself into the validation of the conclusion. Thus, this is all I need to do. Here's my right hand. The point is, if you don't agree with that, the burden of proof is in your court. Show me what else could have led to that. And you would get tenure forever if you were able to do. I mean, I'm sure people have tried, right? But I can't conceptualize how that might even be done, right? But that's what you would have to do to be specific, right? You would have to show that you could not deny necessity, but you would have to demonstrate the impossibility of sufficiency. And that would be a rather complex demonstration. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. And if someone ends up doing this because you ended up watching my videos and figured it out, give me a shout out in your publication, right? Be like, I watched Dr. Campbell's video and I decided to tackle Moore's sufficiency claim. Though he doesn't say this explicitly, it's obviously in there, right? The performative act of this is my right hand is both necessary and sufficient. You can't undermine the necessity, though you might be able to demonstrate the incompatibility with sufficiency by introducing another necessity, right? So that would be, that might have been a little too dense, but you know, I gotta teach it on multiple levels. This stuff is fun. Okay, so B, as I make a certain, more, all right, so necessity, and so you get that. All right, so then 1C, how much time do I have? My goodness. Jeez. 1C, quote, the premise was quite certainly different from the conclusion, right? The premise was quite certainly different from the conclusion. That is, it's not tautological, right? So remember, that claim, the premise is quite certainly different from the conclusion, legitimizes the previous claim, the very first thing under three conditions needed to satisfy the proof, unless the premise, which I adduced as proof of the conclusion, was different from the conclusion I adduced it to prove. Then we look at 1C, the premise was quite certainly different from the conclusion, right? So he legitimizes the claim that the premise is different from the conclusion. The question is, how is the premise different from the conclusion? The premise has something that the conclusion doesn't have. What does the premise have that the conclusion doesn't have? The premise has the gesticulation of his right and left hand. The conclusion follows from the demonstration. It's the demonstration, again, one more time, it's the demonstration that satisfies the condition of both necessity and sufficiency, right? Now we're just at that level. There's no other way to say that, right? So hopefully I haven't scared people off, but I told you it was going to get complex, right? I told you it was going to get complex. Okay, so premise. Here's the premise. And this is a direct quote from Moore, right? But the premise was something far more specific than this something which I expressed by showing you my hands, right? And that, namely, is the demonstration. I'll read that again. But the premise was something far more specific than this. And what is the premise again? Just so that we understand. Now, by holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a gesture with my right hand, here is one hand. That's the premise. That is something far more different that, I want to quote it directly, quote, by holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with my right hand, here is one hand. That is something far more different than two human hands exist. That is something dramatically different from the claim two human hands exist, right? So he demonstrates yet again, internally, logistically now, not just sort of a performative act, but internal to the logic, demonstrate the distinction between the performance and between the performance, right? Between the premise as performance and the conclusion, which denies any claim to tautology in his argument, right? That's completely fallacious. You might be able to demonstrate that Moore did not satisfy the condition for sufficiency, but you could never demonstrate that it was tautological because the performative act itself makes it different. Okay, and thus the conclusion then, and then I'll pause and switch out my batteries because I'm already at an hour. And then the conclusion was merely, this is a direct quote, right? Quote, the conclusion was merely two human hands exist at this moment, right? At this moment being, I erased it, being the importance of now, right? Two human hands exist at this moment. Why is that important? Moore says specifically, I didn't cite the passage in my notes, but Moore says specifically, we do not need to have multiple examples, right? I don't need to have any number of examples. I don't need to be able to identify this proof in anything else, because all that any other proof would do of a similar sort, of a similar demonstration, is to sort of reinforce what I've already done. There's no need for me to talk about external reality other than the example that I just gave, right? Because if you're talking about any other thing, then you're not adding, your argument and your quote-unquote proof doesn't add any more meaning, any more significance than the demonstration that I just gave, right? And in terms of epistemological understanding of sort of the paradigm, if you will, and to take this to a paradigm shift is only legitimate. Arguments, new quote-unquote arguments, are only legitimate insofar as they account for holistically everything the preceding paradigm or preceding argument accounted for, but offer something different, right? So if you have my demonstration as A, and you attempt to say that you've created something new, but all you've done is demonstrated A, then you haven't done anything that I have. You have to do sort of, this is a ghetto version of what I'm saying. You have to account for everything that I accounted for, but something that I have not. And what Moore is saying is that there isn't anything else that you could account for in external reality. You don't need other proofs. You don't have to deconstruct everything as Descartes did, and then reconstruct all of external reality, including numbers and you know, what have you, and you know, physical objects and such as mind-dependent. No, you just need one example, right? You can extrapolate from this one example in Cartesian terms, because it is and this is what's genius, right? It is primary. It's seminal. It's a property of sort of the logical consistency of any example, right? So there's nothing more that can be added, argues Moore, right? And I think that's an incredibly important point. So what I'm going to do at this section now is I'm going to pause, switch the batteries out so I don't lose any of my content, especially for this lecture, and then we'll come back and talk about the last half page on page 10. Hopefully I can get that done in an hour as well. So I'm gonna pause the video now.